Now I'd like to introduce Shawn Nowlan, Director, Client Services, R Systems. Shawn started his professional life as an electrical engineer in Detroit, working for Ford Motor Company, and transitioned to consulting over the next 7 years. Engineering and consulting gave him access to complex issues at multiple companies. He enjoyed learning what makes problems difficult to solve and taking them on. He enjoys collaborating with others who are equally passionate about challenging themselves. He has broad experience across technologies and services to help him tackle almost anything, but enjoys solving issues in healthcare, specifically by using analytics and automation to help improve revenue cycle and clinical outcomes. Shawn works for our system, helping clients with services for IT and revenue cycle. All right, Shawn, take it away.
Thank you. I wrote a shorter one. That one sounds too fancy. I'm going to take you guys through a little bit of a journey. I'll explain the problem of denials and prior auth, and then we'll talk about some possible solutions. This is not going to be generative AI. It just won't be. And I still have a lot of concerns about generative AI. I know that these slides look a little bit small, so I'm going to highlight a couple things. But I just want to say, you're not crazy. Denials are going up. It's good they're going up for everybody. It's really happening. And it went from 11% to 12%, and now it looks like it's continuing to climb. 1.6 billion a month in denials, and that's $262 billion a year. It's a tremendous amount of money, And prior authorization denials make up a big piece of that. So 40% approximately is the prior authorization denials as a pain point. So prior auth is a big deal for almost everybody out there. There are other denial causes for sure, but prior auth is a big deal. The denials, prior authorization denials have gone up a lot as well, from 2.5% of gross revenue to from 1.5% to 2.5% of gross revenue, which is a huge increase, almost 70%. So it's getting to be a bigger and bigger problem, and I think it's hard to understand just how expensive this is for everyone. So denials for Medicare Advantage increased over 50% in the first half of 2023. Commercial revenue impacted by denials rose 20% in that same half year. Cash on hand for all of you dropped from 173 days to 124 days. Now, that's on average. There are people operating with less than 30 days of cash on hand, and that's super uncomfortable, right? If you don't make payroll, it's really hard to get everybody to show up to work. So as denials grow, it becomes a bigger and bigger deal. And fixing the denials and just getting the right kind of prior authorization attention is expensive. 14 hours a week completing prior authorization requests from physicians and staff. That's a lot of time that could be done, it could be used to do something with patients. Clinical documentation and payer policies are huge drivers, and lack of quality data going in. I want you to know that all your colleagues are kind of saying the same thing, right? After staffing, denials is the number one concern, and that's in the revenue cycle. Just a few down are slow payer responses and prior authorization issues. And when you think about how much time it takes to do prior auth, and that staffing of revenue cycle folks is so hard, it just compounds your problem, right? You're more and more likely to be spending time in this cycle trying to get prior auth or trying to fix it after in the denial process. So today we have delays in patient care, increased administrative burden, a whole bunch of frustration and inefficiency. And every insurance company is different. I'm sure you guys know this, right? Everybody you deal with is going to have a slightly different process for prior auth, and they're going to have a different response time for prior auth. So what we're going to talk about in this future state is how we might automate some of that, streamline some of the processes, and try to get this under control. And this is a big deal for patients too. Remember, this prior authorization process is really for them. It's to get them the care they want, potentially the drugs that they want after you've decided what's wrong with them. It's really a big deal for them. So I don't want you to think that this is just a revenue cycle problem. It's really not. And when you have prior authorization issues and you decide to delay that care, you end up with wasted time for facilities, whether that's an operating room or something else, wasted time for physicians and other folks. So when we talk about how to get a healthy prior authorization process together, we'll talk about prior auth days out as an intermediary metric to try and figure out, are you affecting it properly? Let's talk about these prior authorization denials and some of the key causes for that. So some things sound really stupid, right? But the wrong prior authorization number in the claim form. Just small details like that are easy to miss. And that's not going to be the end of the world, right? You get that rejection, you send it back. But it is more time, right, wasted. Authorization is invalid for the service date or the procedure. Limited communication and collaboration. So maybe you're not getting all the information that to the insurance company that they want. There's a lack of standardization and transparency across the process. You don't know why you're denied sometimes, or different denials come from different insurance companies. So I'm sure that you guys are feeling most of this pain. And I feel like there are different mandates and different things coming along all the time. Oh, wait. I haven't flipped the slides. What's going on? Let me go back. So, I didn't even look at the screen. Isn't that terrible? Okay, so let's go back to prior authorizations are a big deal for everyone. Let's see if we can do that. Can you click one slide forward? Thanks. So this is where we talked about 40% of from this survey, right? 40% of folks said that prior authorization denials were their biggest pain point, and that they're becoming a bigger and bigger part of revenue. So prior authorization denials going from 1.5% of gross revenue to 2.5% of gross revenue in just a year. That's a huge increase in real money. And I'm sure that everyone is feeling this pain. So prior authorization denials are a big deal for everybody. It's not just you. And just from a show of hands, does anybody see a rise in prior authorization denials or pain in prior authorization? I see a couple of head nods. Go to the next slide. And these slides are all, they'll all be available through the app eventually. Prior authorization and denials management is super expensive. And it's expensive from just a revenue decrease perspective, and it's expensive from a trying to fix it perspective. So if you just look at all the time that goes into trying to deal with denials after the fact, that's a very expensive process. and you don't know how much that revenue you're going to be able to reclaim. Everyone's looking at RCM resources as scarce right now, so just having your team spend more time on prior authorization and denials makes them less efficient. And then you need more staff to kind of clean up the mess. Specifically, Medicare Advantage denials increased in the first half of 2023, and they increased a lot, by over 50%. It's a massive increase. And commercial revenue impacts by denials were up over 20%, just in that same 6-month period. I talked about cash on hand, and I'm going to say it again because the slide's up. But that cash on hand has dropped by almost a third. It's a huge decrease in cash on hand, from 173 to 124 days. And like I said, some organizations they don't have 173 days in the first place. So that decrease in cash on hand is really painful for them. A physician and staff, physicians and staff spent 14 hours a week completing prior authorization requests. That, again, is a lot of time that could be spent with patients. And I think payer policies are changing a lot, and everybody's feeling that pressure, right? And feeling that confusion. Things that used to get approved are not getting approved quite the same way. If we go to the next slide and just look at what your colleagues are saying, and this is an HFMA survey that was done, looking at biggest challenges in the revenue cycle. After staffing, denials were number one. And you can see how you could get in this spiral. As your denials increase, you become more and more understaffed in revenue cycle, just because they're trying to clean up that denials mess. Just below that are payer policies and requirements, which are fueling more denials. And then you see prior authorization in this list as well, where it says authorization and prior authorization. So all these things are kind of compounding, right? Prior authorization issues, denial issues, and staffing issues all kind of add up to real problems across the HFMA brethren. And when we're asked what's the most time-consuming process for your front-end team, it's prior authorization. So we're going to talk about some ways to try and fix that as we go through. If we go to the next slide and just look at what it's like today, prior authorization problems with prior authorization is creating delays in patient care. And as I was saying, don't forget, this is not like a revenue cycle problem only. This is a patient-facing problem. This is a consumer experience problem, right? If you can't get the care that you need when you need it, if you can't get the medications you need when you need it, it becomes a big deal for your patients. It is a big administrative burden on doctors to go try and figure this out. There's a lot of frustration and inefficiency in the process. Every insurance company is a little bit different. Every payer is a little bit different. So it's very confusing for people trying to get those prior authorization requests filled. And it makes it all get delayed. And those things cause delays for the patient, but also inefficiencies in your system, right? Utilization issues for physicians, utilization issues for facilities. So what we're going to go through a little bit in this future state is a way to streamline some of these processes, do a little bit of automation in these processes to take some of the load off and really improve patient access to timely care. Let's go to the next slide. So, what are the big causes of prior authorization denials? And some of these things are silly, like I said. Missing the right prior authorization number in the claim form, that's something you can fix and easily resubmit. But it does create this chain of delays. There's a limited amount of communication and collaboration in this prior authorization process. There's a delay just in getting an answer from some of the payers. So you make some of these small mistakes, wait a couple of days, resubmit, wait a couple of days. You've blown a week before you know it, honestly. And there are a lot of complex and evolving mandates from the payers, and insufficient documentation is cited as a big reason for these prior authorization denials. I'm going to go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about the manual process and this new revolution in prior auth. So a lot of paper, a lot of online portals, a lot of people trying to figure out what exactly to do for each different case. You can end up in phone calls, on hold, because there's so many different forms and requirements across insurers. It's a complex process for everybody. The idea is to automate a lot of these tasks, standardize the interface from your staff, streamline the communication, do as much from an automated perspective so less mistakes are made. When we reduce those errors, right, it can speed up the process a lot. And then just putting back in that status, knowing that that you're okay, or knowing that you have to go back and fix something, can highlight what's coming next. Okay, let's go to the next slide. There's two different parts of this that can be automated. So after you figure out what's wrong with the patient, or after you don't figure out what's wrong with the patient and decide more testing is required, there may be a need to try and get prior authorization. You can have the clinician figure that out and do something about it, or you can try to automate some of that process. I will say that automating that is more difficult in general. Trying to automate that finding of need, it's always going to have some people in the loop to try and figure out when prior authorization is needed. But you can create some triggers or some checks, automated checks, so that you catch some of the mistakes, you catch the misses, or you automate the easy things inside of prior authorization. And like I said, it's usually at diagnosis, or if you get to the end of whatever review of test information and you need to do some different diagnostic, that's when you're typically going to need to do prior authorization. The other part of this is to automate the prior authorization request, and that's one by one automating to each of the payers across your topology. Filling out the right kind of prior authorization info, gathering up the right documentation to send to them, doing the status checks, making sure you know when you have prior authorization or when you got rejected, and doing something about it, right? Whether you need to cancel or reschedule an appointment, resubmit with more info, or do something else, like give it to a person. Most people are focusing on that second piece, that prior authorization request process. And when I say most people, I mean most people that are offering technology solutions in this space, and I mean most hospitals or physician practices. They're mostly focused on that right half, that prior authorization request process with the payers. But I don't want to diminish the need checking. Okay, let's go to the next slide and talk about ways to do prior authorization automation. So robotic process automation, RPA, has been the traditional approach, and that was a good start. It has some limitations, right? It's only able to make as many decisions as you give it. And what we find is when we add in a little speech science and machine learning, we can make more complex decisions and do some things that look more like AI. It's a little more responsive, a little more resilient as we add in some of those extra technologies. But there are still needs to have people look at the things that fail. So I don't want anybody to think that this is going to be an all automation kind of solution. No matter what you do, you're always going to have people in the loop. And the best systems out there learn from what the people do to fix those problems. So this human in the loop process feeds the model, feeds the machine learning process so that it understands what to do the next time, what different documentation to gather, what different things to do in the process. And over time, that process gets more and more automated. So if you start at 30%, you'll get better over time. Let's go to the next slide. So there are always low complexity requests and high complexity requests. And the low complexity requests are easier, obviously, to automate. And over time, we move up that scale of complexity and get more and more automation robots, or whatever you want to call them, to move through the process. And in the beginning, right, you're going to need a triaging engine to look at each of these different requests and decide, what is it really, right? Should I bother to try to push it through the process, this automated process, or should I immediately kick it out to a person to go do? So that triaging process is important, and makes sure that you're not, wasting time getting a rejection because the system's not ready to automate that kind of request. If you keep everything inside this machine learning loop, though, it learns from those things that go through people. Go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about the kinds of things that can be automated. And I don't know if everybody can see this because the colors are weird. But on the low complexity stuff, it might be, hey, we've identified this drug therapy, and so we're going to go get prior authorization for this drug therapy. Or, we're going to go grab prior authorization for this investigative experimental procedure. Those kinds of things tend to be easier to automate, believe it or not. And we can have dynamic rules based on these requests. Moving up the scale might be a sleep study or something like that you want to do for a patient. That's in the kind of mid-complexity. And then as we get higher in complexity, things like neurosurgical procedures, those kinds of things might be more complex, and you need to kick those, especially in the beginning, to a real human. And then our best example for very high complexity prior auth is transplants. So understanding that these are also, as we go up in complexity, they make up a smaller volume of prior authorization requests. So you're going to get a lot of bang for the buck just focusing on those lower complexity, mid complexity kinds of volumes, and you'll hit 75% if you just get that low and mid chunk done. And over time, you can get more and more of these processes automated, so you get closer to 80. But there's always going to be these very high complexity cases that you need a person to do. Does that make sense to everybody? Go to the next slide. So I can't emphasize this enough. So many automation initiatives fail for the wrong reasons. It's because nobody is bothering to gather up the metrics of what it's doing for your organization. Nobody's figuring out what it's done to denials and how denials have dropped. And some people will say, gosh, well, we did 7 other things, Shawn. So how do I know how much is attributed to this prior authorization project? It doesn't matter. Measure it and show it off and declare victory and say, hey, there were these other projects going on at the same time, but this was certainly a contributor to this benefit. If you just look at the savings of time for your people, you're never going to be gathering all the buckets of value that made this a good project to do, and you're never going to get to that next automation project if you don't gather up all the benefits. You need management buy-in from the beginning, and you need to go back to them periodically and show them your metrics and let them know that this is having an impact. And look, the pandemic was a huge distraction, but there are distractions all the time. Building a new building, local labor shortages, cyber attacks. Management will get distracted for sure. Make sure that you're always ready to come back with the value that your project's delivering inside of automation. So yes, labor savings, but make sure you're taking advantage of showing those denials improvements. Make sure that you're showing the change in appointment cancellations due to prior auth. Make sure that you're showing OR utilization changes or other facilities utilization changes due to prior auth. Show the revenue from some of those specialty practices if you have them. And look, be creative. If you want to just look at provider happiness as a function of taking some of the prior auth burden off of them, absolutely collect those metrics. And don't be shy about putting those intangible benefits like staff happiness into your metrics. So next time I do this, I'll make those words bigger so that you can see them. Does it make sense to everybody, though? And I don't know. Show of hands who feels like they've done an amazing job gathering metrics for a project that they did. We have one. But it's hard to do. You feel like the work is done already. You did all the hard work of automating. You want to go to the next thing, but you have to go back and measure what you did and the effect of it, or you'll never get to the next thing. Okay. So should you do this yourself, or should you get some help? And I would say you might have some fantastic people in your organization that want to do automation. You might have a whole automation team. You might have a speech science team, and then they might want to really take this on. You might be part of a university system, and they have this initiative, and you're feeding off of that. There are really good reasons for doing it yourself. If you're a massively huge system, you can leverage that automation everywhere, and you're going to get the benefit everywhere. So those are all good reasons to do it yourself. And then you own the IP, and it's fantastic, right? But for almost everybody else, it's a better idea to have somebody else do it. They're going to be doing it for multiple people. They're going to bring better technical staff for this particular problem. And you're not going to have to tear up a whole bunch of people, take them off whatever they're doing, and focus them on this. So you have less process disruption. You'll have better savings, and you'll see those year-over-year incremental gains without having a massive investment. you can decide how much cultural shift and move there really is. Obviously, your folks are going to have some change, right, to use the automated system, but it won't be the same kind of shift. It's lower risk to put this on somebody else, and then you can hold their feet to the fire and make sure that that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And it's generally a lot less investment from your side if you're having somebody else do it, because they've already done it before, and so they're going to be leveraging the stuff they've done for other people, or they're going to be using a system that does this, that's already built, and they're just putting your hooks in. So I just want to make sure everybody is on board with me. Using this kind of managed service model really makes sense, especially for some things that get to be more, speech science-y or complex. So the next slide, we'll just look at a few business benefits, and I talked about gathering your metrics at the end. But when you're trying to sell this up your organization, you want to say, hey, we're going to get faster treatment for patients. It should be a patient-centered conversation. We're going to have productivity gains and reduced operational costs, less waste, but focus, and less administrative burden on doctors, but focus on those faster treatment for patient pieces in the improved patient outcome pieces. Because I think we've talked about it a lot over the last couple of days, but we should be focused on making the patient's life a little bit better, right? We want to get those great letters, like the financial counselor we heard about, that really brought light into somebody's life when they were going through cancer treatment. Let's focus on the patients and those patient changes as the best of the benefit chunks. Go to the next slide. So this is just one prior authorization case study. Twice the speed to collect status and submit prior authorization. So a lot less time preparing that prior authorization request and submitting it. And so twice the speed of getting those things in and done. Improved business productivity, no backlog of prior auth because it is mostly automated for most of the requests. Reduced operating costs were the result. But in this process, we took a hospital's RCM team and helped them get health insurance prior auth done. At the time, they had a huge backlog already. It was very time consuming. There were a ton of pending claims due to delayed follow-ups on rejected prior authorization. And just I talked about some of those stupid mistakes, just like typos. It fixed all the typos. And that went through and used intelligent process automation. I don't know why, but we decided to rename robotic process automation IPA. And I know it in the slide it says IPA, but it's intelligent process automation. It's robotic process automation with a little bit of speech science for flavor, if you will. And you can see the minutes per claim difference between the manual and the bot process, about half. They went from 14 people doing prior auth to 3, which is fantastic change. And you can tell, right, that this was not a massive system, right? If they had 14 people doing prior auth, it wasn't Providence. So you can scale these benefits based on how big your organization is. Any questions? we did this, we started this about, I want to say 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And it's pretty mature now. Now there's more than one organization doing it. But I guess my point of saying it's 4 years old is to make sure that, it's not like a ChatGPT, like crazy AI solution. It's a pragmatic AI solution, if you will. Okay, go to the next slide. And we used prior auth as a way to talk about automation in the revenue cycle, but there are a whole bunch of places in the revenue cycle to do automation. And today, the as-is processes require a whole bunch of specialized information from your staff, a whole bunch. People that are good at prior auth have been in revenue cycle for a long time. They understand a lot about what the procedures are. They understand the different nuances of all the different payers. These people are more and more hard to find. And I feel like the revenue cycle folks, the normal rank and file people in revenue cycle, are getting more and more specialized. I don't think we really appreciate how much accumulated knowledge they have. And so eventually these people are going to retire. You can't have all people that have been here for 20 years and know how to do everything, right? And this goes across so many different pieces, not just prior auth. But it's about credentialing and chart audits and getting the right kind of information back into the heads of providers and provider education. It's about coding and verification, claim scrubbing and submission. All these different pieces are ripe for automation. If you just look at patient registration and all the things you do afterward, eligibility verification, any kind of prior auth that you need to do, doing patient reminders, just getting out patient billing at the appropriate time, billing reminders, all these things are really ripe for automation if we haven't done it yet. So I want to be clear that it's not the end after you do prior auth. There's a million other things to do. But doing this prior auth piece and getting denials under control will help you free up some staff time or take the benefit in staff reductions. Go to the next slide. And maybe hit the slide one more time. So I think there's a build or something. So every place you see a bot is a place where there's automation that exists today that you could go use. And I don't mean from our systems. I mean from a host of vendors. A host of people have automation in each of these different places. Yes, we do it at our systems, but we're not the only ones. We're not the only people that came up with this idea. We're not the only people automating prior auth. We're not the only people doing eligibility verification. Or we're not the only people doing denials automation. So all these things are out there and possible. You can't do it all at once, but if you do that first project, gather the right metrics, and feed your management with the right information, you can keep a sustainable automation initiative alive at your organization. I'm going to go to one more slide, but then I'm going to come back to that slide because it's my favorite one. So the vision is to do more and more automation over time. And this shows a specific bias here, right? We're saying outsource to get an immediate reduction in cost, and then automate to get a continuing reduction in cost. And that reduction in cost is not just cost to staff, right? It's cost of denials and cost to staff. So as you put in more and more automation, and as you automate some of those more sophisticated cases, you can really get to a much reduced cost of transaction inside your revenue cycle. So I'm going to go back to the bot slide and open it up for questions. Go ahead. Oh, wait for the microphone.
Thank you, Shawn. This was really great presentation, and going through the whole life cycle is very helpful. As you are building these models to create the automation using machine learning AI being pretty expensive right now, how do you see your, what type of large language models you are using, and how do you see the cost to make it available for your customers that going to reduce later, or the models are going to change? Or if you can please talk a little bit about that part.
Yep. So the language models that we use are trained on hospital data, our customers' hospital data. We take those language models and use them for new customers, and then those language models get refined for that new healthcare provider. We don't go out and get large language models that are out there gathering information across the internet. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The one is, of course, they didn't exist before. The second one is they don't necessarily, they're not being trained on good data. So I'm not going to get a repeatable result from a language model that's searching the internet in general. I need it to make decisions the way we make decisions inside our organization, or at least at another hospital. I can't have it going off track. So I think we've all heard about these hallucination examples from ChatGPT. That is not something that you should put up with inside of your revenue cycle, right? You should not be using uncontrolled data for training your language models for doing coding or doing prior auth or for doing denials responses. That's not a high probability path to follow. So in my mind, it's not gonna change because of those ChatGPT pieces. It's going to change because more of you are going to be using machine learning inside of your organizations, and more of your data is going to be training the models that are going to be used by all of you. That's where we're going to start to see more efficiency. And I don't know if you guys remember Olive, but they made that huge splash and then they disappeared. But the ideas were pretty good. Like, automate the revenue cycle, use speech science to put some machine learning into the revenue cycle. They mis-executed, but the ideas were sound. And those guys were a customer of our systems. Like, we thought they were going to do well, and then, didn't happen. But it's coming. Go ahead. You've got to... Jenna, get him the microphone.
To that point about Olive, what's that review process look like before you automate a process and you make sure you're not automating a bad process? And a bad process may not be known as being a bad process. So right now, the current process generates one mistake a month, and that's manageable and not seen as a bad process. When you throw a bot on there and you pump steroids into it, now it's that mistake happens 10 times a day. what's that process to make sure that we're not, creating that and exacerbating this non-issue now, but when it's happening 24/7 nonstop, it is a problem.
Yeah. So 5 years ago, we would have sent in a team and interviewed your team and mapped out the process. And then we would have had a process expert go through and make good decisions about fixing the process before we automated it. And so all those consultants that did that kind of process analysis were essential. Absolutely. Today, we're more likely, especially if it's a complex process that we don't already have automated, we're more likely to do some process discovery. And there are a few people that do it, UiPath, Automation Anywhere, Celonis. Everybody has their process discovery tools, and they will map the process flow inside a system and between systems, including email processes and other things. And they'll track end-to-end that process. And it's really pretty amazing to watch, to see your process show up on the screen and watch the happy path, and then watch all the other paths pop out, all the exception paths pop out. And then you decide, hey, what are the things we're going to tackle? Where should we start to automate? Where does it really make sense? And, it can be eye-opening. Gosh, I didn't know that we had a process that had so many paths through. And so I think it does help people even just visualize their processes. And just showing those processes to people can be compelling. Les.
So I appreciate the example where you're showing real FTE savings on this, but I'm curious, what size do you need to be to benefit from this type of automation?
Yeah. So so you have to know what the pain is. So as I said before, if you're just looking at FTE savings, then you're probably screwing it up. You're not selling it right to your management. You should be looking at, what aren't we getting paid for sure. How much time are we spending trying to fix denials, fix prior authorization? But you should also be looking at efficiencies in your facilities use, in your doctor's use, and how many times are you canceling appointments for patients? How often are you delaying care? And do you have maybe a couple horror stories that you can highlight where someone was delayed care and had a worse health outcome? I mean, that's really what we're trying to prevent, right, is a worse health outcome because this prior authorization process took so long that that patient got worse. Go ahead.
The one thing that it does impact staffing and always seems to be a player that isn't at the table are the contracting folks. And administrative costs makes up our big gap in the world. That's where we're driven to double digits when everyone else can manage it. And that is because there's a motive, there's a great compensation for the payers. We worked, all the years I've worked, we've had so many technology options to automate. We've had standardization. And but when I like to measure the cost, administrative cost per payer, and when you have to staff 3 times the work hours for a Med Advantage payer than it's traditional Medicare because it's costing you that much, and when we went to arbitration one time, the payer had us as being inept. We didn't do something fast enough. My position, and what hasn't come up with the payers and contracting, is we're staffed to not police our contracts. Right or wrong, we're pathetically depending on a contracting good faith. And if there's not a good faith, then all the work, all the automation, really, it has to start with them being measured and reported on. But when you do that, at least from revenue cycle, you're the only one at the table. Contracting's not there. they're not interested in holding them to the fire, their feet to the fire. But that would be just one of the things that if you look at what would cost less, it would be, or to have them pay for that administration. The lack of value, showing that what they did to delay those cases, how much benefit really came out of it compared to just the same cases in another thing. It's openly, they're just doing it to make money, and we all know that.
So how many times are you going back to negotiate with payers saying, this is how much you cost me in denials and prior authorization churn and other crap? Like, how often are you going back to them and saying, these denials are a cost to my business, and you only have 10% of my population, but you were 20% of my denials cost, and you cost me this much labor and this much revenue? How many people are going back into contract negotiations with that kind of data? I don't think anyone is, honestly. Go ahead.
So,
I'll just, one quick thing. I worked with a group in New York at HFMA hospitals, and I had no idea that what they'd been working on with some experts that had never been in our business. And one of the things that he asked me is, I've never seen a business or any industry that signs and executes a contract without ever testing to see if they can be billed properly or paid properly. Why would any industry do that? And I never thought about it, but really, it's true. We do go into billions of dollars of business without ever testing one single agreement.
just to add, Judy, I really appreciated your comments, the first ones and also that secondary one. To add to Les's question, or the answer to that, if I may, denials by payer, reporting back. Denials by payer, reporting to yourself, denials by payer by month. Are you seeing a reduction? What's your cost of the, and if maybe you don't do it by an individual insurance company, but you do it across all of your, start with all of your insurances. Are you seeing a reduction in that type of denials? What's your cost of denials? Add up once or twice a year, add up the number of FTEs that you have there. Also, what's your, if you have a particular problem with a particular insurance company, measure your AR days by that insurance company as compared to the rest of your AR days, or within the group of managed Medicare or managed Medicaid or commercial or whatever the case may be. But you can start to get to those, value statements. We don't do it very well, but it's not that hard to get to if you just come up with a plan and start to measure a few pieces.
And I know we were talking about being collectively more powerful when we work together on projects like that. An example, I contracted with Kaiser, and because data is very valuable, and trust me, they use it. And when we went back to do a denial report, and by the way, with all of these denials by this CPT code, how many were reversed after one appeal? Gee, 85%. It costs you to have to administer that process just like it did us. So let's come to some agreement. Let's bring in clinical. Let's see if we can redo this, because it's costing them money just like it did, a vendor. And so data is so powerful. And I went to another HFMA meeting where they had a group of providers together. We were talking about specific experiences with payers, and they were talking about, maybe we need to pull this data together. Are we seeing the same type of denials? And we need maybe to collectively go to that provider when we do contract negotiations and bring up the stats, because data is so important and powerful.
And Kaiser's really good at that, right? Kaiser's revenue is first subscriptions, right? Just the insurance money that everybody pays them. And then their second biggest stream is risk adjustments on population health. And then the last one is revenue cycle. So like they're actually doing population health. And I know they're not the only ones, but for sure that they think of revenue cycle management third because it's less of their money.
Shawn, can you please talk a little bit about the data protection policies when you are doing and looking at this data, going through this bot processing and giving the results what you're showing in that case study, which is amazing. Can you talk a little bit about data protection policies that we all should be keeping in mind?
Yeah. So we do a lot of work in India. We do a lot of work in Eastern Europe. We have resources across the globe. When we do work for U.S. healthcare entities, all that data sits on U.S. servers. When we do work for the U.K. Health payer, it sits on data centers in the UK. We go through the rest of the EU, right? The data sits in the EU. And then there are controls on all those accesses to data. There's controls on what data gets shared in between clients, what goes back into the model, and what's allowed to be reused. And we take a lot of care in making sure that people's data is protected. In general, we haven't had any healthcare provider say, gosh, don't use the data that you trained your models on. Don't help any other healthcare organization. We just want to keep it for ourselves. So far, everybody's been willing to share that kind of, resultant model, whether that's in the automated coding process or in the prior authorization process or in the other kinds of denials management processes that we've automated. So I feel like we're prepared to only use your data for you, but for the most part, health systems seem to be okay with helping other health systems. Mm-hmm. Do they still get CPE credit if I end 3 minutes early?